often been said that imitation is the highest form of flattery. How many of you actually believe that? Okay, so a few people. Well, in many cases, imitation can be quite disrespectful and it can even be harmful. Today I'm going to talk to you guys about why cultural appropriation is harmful to marginalized groups. According to an article written by Maisha Johnson titled, "What's Wrong with Cultural Appropriation?" Cultural appropriation can best be defined as a power dynamic in which members of a dominant group take elements of a culture of people who have been systematically oppressed by that dominant group. This topic is relevant to you guys because understanding cultural appropriation is important for your social intelligence and sensitivity, especially in your professional career. So this is a very valuable skill for you to have, and it should honestly take you a long way by just being socially aware. So other than doing extensive research on the topic, I've experienced the downsides of cultural appropriation in regards to being black and having natural hair and noticing that a lot of my features aren't exactly acceptable on people that look like me. So to start things off, two reasons why cultural appropriation is harmful is one because it enforces stereotypes, and two, because it trivializes the oppression of marginalized groups. So first, I'm going to tell you about how cultural appropriation contributes to harmful stereotypes. When taking part in cultural appropriation or cultural borrowing, you run the risk of reinforcing a lot of really negative stereotypes. So Katy Perry, for example, she is actually a repeat offender of cultural appropriation. And for a second, I'm just going to let you guys take a look at her 2013 AMA performance. Please pay attention to the way she's dressed and the movement as well as the choreography. To debrief it a little bit, she is dressed as a geisha, and in this performance, she takes a lot of influence from Asian culture. So just take a look. So, during this performance, as you guys may have noticed, she was sporting a very sexualized version of what may be seen as Asian culture. So, for example, in the video, she was wearing a kimono, which is native to Japanese culture, but typically it is more covered. But in the video, I don't know if you guys noticed, but the upper part of her body was very open and exposed, and that is not true to Japanese culture. Second of all, the song title in itself, Unconditionally, reinforces a stereotype that Asian women are typically calm and docile and subservient. So, to give a little bit of background about where these stereotypes came from, according to an article in the Journal of Women Therapy titled Asian American Women, this stereotype stems from the U.S.'s involvement with the Philippine Wars and Japan and China in World War II, more recently the Korean and Vietnamese Wars, in which Asian women were perceived as value commodities for sex, and they were provided as a means of rest and cooperation from men in war zones. As a result of Asian women being viewed this way as cheap commodities during wartime, these women were often relegated to objects of fetishization and objectification. The same article goes on to mention that the state of media representation of Asian women often feeds the sentiment that these women are exotic and that their features and their qualities are the only complex things about them, and it really relegates them and puts them in a box. And that's pretty much what Katy Perry was doing in her performance, pretty much. So by participating in cultural appropriation, specifically in Katy Perry's case, Asian culture, she unknowingly contributed to a long history of misrepresentation and the relegation of Asian women. Now that we've discussed how cultural appropriation feeds stereotypes, let's move on to how it trivializes the oppression of marginalized groups. Appropriating a culture can amplify and disregard the oppression of many marginalized groups. One example of this is the NFL team, the infamous NFL team named the Washington Redskins. It uses a slur which has been used against Native Americans, and it perceives an image of Native Americans as their mascots, as props. And the uses of this phrase has negative roots which associates the term, it has negative roots associated with the term, and it shows an extreme disregard for the history of violence and genocide that the natives experienced throughout our history. In 1863, the Winona Daily Republican in Minnesota featured an announcement that stated, "The state reward for dead Indians has been increased to 200 for every redskin sent to purgatory. This sum is more than the dead bodies of all the Indians east of the Red River Ord." So here you can see that the term Redskins is being used to refer to Native Americans during a time when white Americans were encouraged to kill them and to capture them for monetary rewards. Ignoring this facet of history and implementing this phrase as an image for their mascot is blatant disregard for the genocide and the mistreatment of Native Americans, and it kind of prolongs it. In a 2006 article published by Richard Rogers in the Journal of Communication Theory titled "From Cultural Exchange to Transculturation," it suggests that many Native Americans were also subjected to cultural cleansing, which served to assimilate them to American culture. And because of this, Native Americans were torn from their roots and continue to be oppressed, having their culture used as a mascot, and it only oppresses them even further. Another way that cultural appropriation can add to the oppression of marginalized groups is when these dominant groups freely partake in the culture of the subordinate groups. So, for example, in a lot of work environments, traditional African American styles are prohibited, and the policies suggest that the styles are unprofessional. But in pop culture, these same styles are uplifted on non-black people, and is seen as less of a tradition and more of a statement. So, to conclude, I've talked to you about how participating in cultural appropriation contributes to harmful stereotypes and further trivializes the oppression of marginalized groups. While appropriation may seem trivial at surface level, it holds a lot of power. I encourage each of you to take cultural appropriation seriously and to remember that to respect and partake in a culture, you must have some type of understanding of the culture's history and the significance to those cultures.